Oh boy, I finally managed to beat Empire of Cats Chapter 3 Moon. Finally, after such a long grind, I get to claim my reward that the game's been teasing me. Bahamut Cat. Yo, look at him, he looks so cool. Look at this gigantic energy ball that goes boom. He looks so strong. He's gotta be really strong, right guys? Okay, but alright, let's just get right into it. You probably already know the myriads of problems that people have with Bahamut Cat, and a lot of you most likely have experienced this firsthand. One of his most biggest and obvious problem is that his time between attack is really long. Hey, Post-Edit and Lucas here. Real quick, I just want to tell you that the terminology for the time between the damage of a unit is like really different in different places. There's no consistent naming here, and in this video I might also not really be using a consistent term. My Gamatoto lists this as time between attacks, Catbot lists this as attack time, and Wiki and BCU list this as attack frequency. Make up your damn mind, I'm gonna make a whole new terminology for this. I'm gonna call this attack cycle or attack period or rate of fire. Okay, whatever, but just know that whatever I'm saying in this video generally just means the time between the first damage and the second damage. This is going to be a whole discussion for another day. Anyways, back to the video. And after landing his attack, it takes him 20 seconds for his next attack to land. And during this period of time, he is extremely vulnerable. You could watch the entirety of B-Movie and Bahamut's still not attacking yet. His attack startup animation is also the second problem. It is super long, so he often have problems with missing his attacks, or sometimes he gets interrupted by enemies before finishing his attack. Another problem is like his health is as much as a piece. Some stronger enemies would be able to kill him in 1 or maybe 2 hits. Another problem, this might be a bit trivial, but visually only half of his energy ball actually hits the enemies. These animations are pretty deceiving. At least it's not as bad as Windy's though. My goodness, that one's really bad. With all these issues, most generic ranged generalist Ubers can easily outshine Bahamut, so for most players, you ended up not really using Bahamut for anything at all. Even if you don't use Ubers, he already has another competition, which is Ururun Wolf, which you can obtain for free in Stories of Legend, The Great Escapers. Stat-wise, Ururun is very similar to Bahamut. Her cost is similar, her range is similar, her health is similar, and her DPS is similar. But Ururun has advantage in her basic stats of damage output, just slightly above Bahamut, but she has 10 less range and pricier cost. However, Ururun, unlike Bahamut, actually has a really fast attack rate. Not even just compared to Bahamut, her attack rate is really fast in general, even if you compare it with Ubers. And she has an extra ability to do knockback to all non-metal enemies too. Ururun just feels like a straight up upgrade from Bahamut. Not to mention that even if you use both Ururun and Bahamut at the same time, some of you might already know where I'm going with this, but sometimes Ururun's knockback ability would end up making Bahamut miss. It almost feels like you're discouraged from using him alongside Ururun. Like, man, this Bahamut Cat unit really is kind of sad. It kind of feels like this is kind of the unit where you really only use if you literally have no better options. Like, who would ever recommend using him? Except me! In fact, I think he does particularly well in these stages. Ogre Island, Floor 29 of Infernal Tower, Mount Aku. Not the invasion though. Actually, he might actually be good there too. But those are some examples, there's a couple more. Anyways, we've talked about Crazy Bahamut's wrongs. Time to talk about Crazy Bahamut's rights. Looking at his stats, his damage is actually pretty serviceable, at least when it comes to non-Uber standards. He's definitely much worse in terms of damage output compared to top tier generalist Ubers like Gao or Sirius or Dasley. But it'd be unfair to compare him to them. But then again, even if you compare him with other basic generalist Ubers that aren't super top tier, he's still not great. But let's just look past that for now. His damage is at least serviceable enough to be able to like pass through most mid-game stages, and his range is actually pretty good. 450 isn't the highest in the world, but it's still a pretty good standing range. It's pretty safe and it outranges most non-backliners. His cost is also pretty decent. It's not too cheap, but it's also not pricey. It's pretty good. And his cooldown is, well, it's standard. Being around 2 minutes, which isn't long, isn't short. It's basically the standard, really. But again, most of those things that I've mentioned are just the standard stuff. But there's still a little bit more to him to just being a workable unit. You see, I would say there are maybe 2 actual big strengths of Bahamut that I want to focus on for this video, or at least a unique strength of him. Number 1 being that his damage per hit is really big. Like, even compared to a lot of Ubers, it's pretty dang high. 85,000 damage per hit is a huge nuke damage for a ranged area attacker without any damage multiplier abilities. Most of the ranged generalist unit that has this kind of damage per hit usually relies on an ability or sort, or maybe it's like single target or is a melee damager or something like that. But Bahamut's just a normal range attacker. And moving on to number 2 of his strength is that he has long attack rate. I know, listen, hear me out. Yeah, I know, this was literally in his list of weaknesses. But you see, just saying that the unit has long attack rate doesn't really fully explain on why this is a bad thing. So first, let's get into that. Why is having a long attack rate a bad thing? The two main problems here are that 1, if you miss your attacks, you lose a huge chunk of your damage output. Longer attack rate means bigger damage per hit, and missing Bahamut's 85,000 damage hurts way more than Ururun missing like 15,000 damage. And this is specifically worse for Bahamut because his attack startup is really slow and he misses very easily. If he has Ururun's attack startup, this might not actually be that big of a problem for him. Now, number 2 is that regardless of him missing or not, you cannot independently defend yourself between attacks. If Bahamut is against a lot of peon spam, he heavily relies on other units to keep them away. Ururun, however, is an independent woman who can clearly fight for herself. Sure, you probably still want other units to help keep units off of her, but she can easily disrupt a lot of peons all by herself. You can easily see this in action if you're using her for Manic Eraser, where she can easily hit the Gory Blacks back for every single attack that she does. There are some more minor problems, you know, like, oh, faster attack rate is better for applying debuffs because you're applying it over and over again and stuff like that, but I'm not gonna go too deep into that. Now, like I said, longer attack rate means bigger damage per hit. I mean, in terms of balance anyways. I know that's not the case, like, literally, but if we keep a unit with the same DPS, for example, Ururun Bahamut has pretty similar DPS, but Ururun attacks really fast and Bahamut attacks pretty slow, and Ururun has a pretty small damage per hit while Bahamut has really big damage per hit. I know they have slightly different DPS, but let's just assume that if Bahamut and Ururun has the exact same DPS, then generally the time they would take to kill the same enemy would basically be the same, right? Wrong! Well, it's a bit hard to say actually because again their DPS isn't exactly the same, but another problem is that they also have different attack animations. So to make the comparison a little bit more fair than Bahamut and Ururun, let's just say we replace Ururun with my cool original character, Fasthamut. You see, his catchphrase is "I love fasting" and his VTuber Oshi is Korone. Do not steal. Fasthamut has the same animation of Bahamut, same attack startup and same backswing, and also pretty much the same DPS too. The only thing different is that their attack rate and damage per hit. Fasthamut has lower damage per hit but attacks pretty much constantly. Meanwhile, Bahamut is the usual sluggish self. Going back to the original question, generally these two would probably kill the same enemy about the same time, right? Well, here's the kicker. Even though their DPS is about the same, Bahamut will actually usually kill enemies faster than Fasthamut. And even if he doesn't, he'd only be slower by just a little bit. Oh man, this is hard to explain. Okay, so let me just show you my calculation, right? Maths jump scare. Okay, sorry. I know this probably looks confusing and it's probably quite tough to swallow, but like, okay, just bear with me here. It's not that bad. In this chart, there's 40 different custom units with the same DPS and different attack rate. To make things simpler, I took Bahamut's DPS, which is 4,250, as the base, and I assume that these 40 theoretical units all have no attack startup and no backswing animation, so their attacks are just like instant. This chart is showing how long does it take for these units to kill enemies with certain HPs. They all have the same DPS, only different attack rate. There's ones that attack once per second, there's ones that attack once every 2 seconds, once every 3 seconds, and so on until once every 40 seconds. Each column is to represent different enemies with different HPs, and each row is supposed to represent the unit, all with their different time between attacks. And the data itself is the calculated time on how long will it take for them to kill this enemy in this column. I also put the average number of the whole column at the bottom row so it's easier to compare. Again, this might be hard to read, so I'm gonna take just a couple of samples and turn them into a line chart. I'll take one with the fastest attack speed, slowest attack speed, and a couple in between, as well as the average one. The y-axis is the kill time, meaning the lower it is, the faster you are at killing the enemy. The green line is for the fastest attack speed, the black line is for the slowest attack speed, and the red line is the average time for all speeds. Focus on these three first. You should notice that the black line is under the red line majority of the time. Meanwhile, the green line is above the red line pretty much all the time. So the one with slower attack rate actually does kill enemies much faster majority of the time. There are times where it'll lose to the average time, but you don't lose by that much and it's only a small portion of it. So yeah, what do you know? Units with slower attack rate but bigger damage per hit actually generally kills enemies faster. That's crazy, huh? That being said, this chart also has shown a kind of a huge flaw with slow attack rate unit that I've already mentioned, which is that if you miss your attacks once, oh my goodness gracious, your chart suddenly looks insanely bad. If the one with the fast attack rate unit miss once, then like, the chart is basically the same. And it is really just unfortunate that the main star of the show right here is a unit with problems with his accuracy specifically. Still, damage chart, all these stuff are just theoretical and that's not really a good representation on what's usually happening on the field. This is assuming where you're in a situation where you just be hammering down the same enemy for like 5 minutes and you never miss, which is like, you know, it's not really a good representation. Don't take this chart too seriously, it's mainly just to prove a point, but yeah, let's just see like a true gameplay testings are worth way more. So let's put this into a test. This is a Rain-D with 90,000 HP, which barely survives an 85,000 Bahamut hit. Naturally, this would put normal Bahamut at a disadvantage compared to Fasthamut. Fasthamut would kill this Rain-D slightly faster than Bahamut. He should be able to clean this Rain-D off pretty easily, is what I would say normally. But the situation is actually kinda rigged, because we should look at that. Crazed Bahamut actually kills the Rain-D faster than Fasthamut. Now, if you don't really notice on where the rigged part is, let's talk about yet another advantage for having a slow attack rate, or rather, a disadvantage for having a fast attack rate. You see, your DPS calculation is only going to be accurate if you're constantly attacking whenever you actually can. Okay, let me explain. In this footage, the Rain-D keeps on getting knocked back for every hit Fasthamut does, and in every hit, Fasthamut needs to move forward first and reach the Rain-D before being able to attack again. And that's kind of wasting time. He could have already attacked again immediately after he finishes, but instead he has to spend a little more time moving forward to reach his target. Meanwhile, normal Bahamut is not really wasting time because his attack is still on cooldown while he's moving anyways, so he's still technically constantly attacking as soon as he can. This is actually one of the reasons on why I recommend him over Ururun in Manic Island stage Ogre Island. The start off of Ogre Island can be really rough and you're hoping to push forward a lot at the start. If you don't really have enough damage output, you might not even be able to hit the base. If you're using Ururun, whenever you kill a group of Manic Islands, you're gonna have to push a little bit. And meanwhile, when you're moving forward, that's not really a good use of your time, so you're kind of wasting your DPS here. Bahamut, on the other hand, not only that he has the advantage of being able to do the nuke damage at the island in one hit, he also doesn't really waste his time when he's moving forward because he usually is still on his attack cooldown anyways. So his proper damage output is pretty much still retained. Actually, there's yet another reason to use Bahamut over Ururun here too. Mainly, it's that both of these units tend to die pretty fast when dealing with the main boss, Berserkori. One of the big problems of dealing with Berserkori is the islands are constantly hiding behind Berserkori. Damaging them can prove to be difficult, especially with their threat of Berserkori in front. If Ururun gets knocked back, the islands will be instantly out of her range and she can only hit the islands in the scary state where Berserkori is near her, and at any other time she can't really deal that damage output. Luckily for Bahamut, he just needs to land one good hit to instantly cripple the islands. Once he lands that good hit, he could just die and he pretty much has already served his purpose. But if Ururun dies after only delivering one hit, that's not really great. Funnily enough, this is also where Bahamut's slow attack animation helps. The animation is so long that it allows the enemies to push far enough inside Bahamut's range before his attack lands, so he actually can land a hit on the islands more consistently. I know, I can even find an advantage out of that, that's crazy. Anyways, going back to the main topic of wasted time. Moving forward like that isn't really the only form of wasting time. This also applies to maybe like getting knocked back, or getting slowed and not being able to reach your target, or even getting frozen. You see, getting frozen does not stop your your timer between attacks. So if Bahamut just finishes his attack and he gets frozen, he'll still start his attack 16 seconds later, so his damage output is still normal. Meanwhile, Ururun, or any fast attacking unit really, pretty much wasted all of the times whenever they're frozen. That being said, units whose time between attacks are actually their backswing, for example like Maglev or Awakened Bahamut, Pizza Cat, Housewife, or True Super Feline, but not Super Feline too. These units have 0 time between attacks, so they're supposed to be able to attack as soon as possible, but they need to complete their attack animation before being able to move or attack again. Being frozen will halt your attack animations, therefore this will still be a problem for them. But knocking them back through knockback ability or damage knockback will reset their attack, allowing them to instantly attack again, which is why they're often referred to as rebound units. Speaking of rebound units, let's talk about rebound enemies. Rebound enemies with high knockback count like Gabriel, Puffsly, or Brawlos are often known to be quite a huge pain for most players. Using fast attack rate low damage unit for these guys would just spell certain death for the most part, as you're constantly resetting their attacks. Meanwhile, high damage per hit attacks are great to efficiently deal with them, as they can kill these guys with less rebound happening, killing them in a much cleaner and elegant fashion, hassle-free. On a similar yet different note, this sort of stuff also matters a lot for not just rebounds, but for most enemies with high knockback count in general really. High knockback count enemies like Rain-D has incredible survivability. Not only that they have the range and is fairly tanky, but it also repositions so much. Every time you knock it back, it's just going out of your range, and you're forced to push near towards the enemy's backliner, and that could be pretty risky. Not to mention in stages, for example like in Forest Beast, where there's like infinite of them, if you don't kill them fast enough, they can just stack up. So in a similar fashion with dealing with rebound enemies, when dealing with enemies with high knockback count, it is often preferable to have units with high damage per hit that can instantly take off multiple of their knockback counts at once. This makes it so that the enemies has less chance to reposition themselves, and you'd be able to clear these enemies much more smoothly and faster. Speaking of taking multiple knockbacks at once, this is also particularly important for Akus, and specifically Aku shields. If you're not familiar with Aku shields, basically certain Aku enemies will have this layer of protective shield with them, which would soak up any damage as well as any debuffs. The shield itself has its own health, and you can either manually destroy the shield by pure brute force, or you can use shield breaker units that has a chance to immediately deplete all of the shield's health. However, every time the enemy gets knocked back, true damage, not true debuff, every time it gets knocked back, the shield would regenerate by a certain amount. So it can be very annoying to always have to break the shield every time you knock these Aku enemies back. And that is why if you're able to use a high damage per hit unit and you can skip multiple knockbacks at once, it could be a huge deal. For example, Fallen Bear has 3 knockback counts, which normally means you would need to break the shield 3 times. The first initial shield and the 2 more shields before it dies. But if you're able to skip one of his knockback count using Crate's Bahamut's high damage per hit, you would be able to kill the Fallen Bear so much faster, and that can be a huge deal on stages like Mount Aku, which is why I recommended him there. By first breaking Fallen Bear's initial shield and then you chip it down a bit and then have Bahamut land that huge hit, you're able to deal with the bear much faster as you only need to break the shield 1 more time. Aside from Fallen Bear, Midnight D is also another good example of an enemy you can use the strategy on. This is a combination of the 2 things that I've mentioned earlier. This is an Aku variant of Rain-D with an Aku shield. These 2 traits giving Midnight D crazy survivability, shield and high knockback count means that not only it repositions often, it would also regenerate the shield every single time it does that. This means that Midnight D's effective health is actually incredibly high if you count the shield regenerating every single knockback. But if you're able to land a huge nuke hit on it, his effective health would go down by a huge amount since his shield wouldn't regenerate as much. Now you might think, now I see. You mentioned earlier something about floor 29 of Infernal Tower with Bahamut, right? And floor 29 is that stage that has a lot of Midnight D's, right? So that's why you think he's good there. Well, yeah, but that's not really the main thing on why I actually use him there. You see, I didn't just bring Bahamut Cat for him to be able to skip Midnight D's knockback count, no. Actually, I brought him because I was also lacking damage to deal with the Beefcake Cat enemies as well. And I think Bahamut's a great fit for this job. Because of the chart thing I mentioned earlier, right? Nope. Not that. Actually, just look what's happening on the screen right now. This is bringing you back to the old Craze Cat days. That's right, I am doing Bahamut stacking. Bahamut stacking is not a new thing. It's one of the oldest strategy known to man. The legendary Sun Tzu actually wrote this in the Art of War book. They who stack a bunch of Bahamut before hitting the base is like unnecessarily strategical, but okay. This was one of the most popular strategy to beating Craze Cat much earlier than one usually could. Since Bahamut takes so long to charge up his attacks, you can either let him deal with small peons himself or make him miss his attack on tankier peons, so he would take forever to be able to actually move forward and advance to push to the enemy's base by himself. Then you just take advantage of this to stall for yet another second Bahamut, or third Bahamut even. Bahamut has like 4,250 DPS, which isn't much. But with 2 Bahamuts, you would have effectively 8,500 DPS, which already competes with like top tier Uber's damage output. And this is a feat that only units similar to Bahamut that has a long time between attacks can do. Once again, taking advantage of a unit's weakness and turning them into a strength. Now, what other strength are there? There's like this thing about how slow attack rate units don't get stuck on attack animation too often, which leads them to be able to push forward more and thus being able to target out of reach enemies better. But this topic is honestly barely relevant, mainly for 2 big reasons. One is that you can just use a bunch of peon clearer units like Slime or Courier or any spammable units. And 2, and probably the biggest reason, are that LD units exist, and LD units are able to do this, except way better. They are able to target out of reach enemies pretty much instantly without any setup. LD is just an absolutely busted ability. Being able to pierce through farther than your usual range is just way too good. With its piercing range, you can instantly just hit backliner enemies with no problem at all and no setup. And actually, this isn't the only thing LD unit has that covers the previous strength for low attack rate units that I mentioned. You see, LD units have blind spot, a small range in front of the unit where enemies won't get damage. You can also abuse this blind spot by letting small weak peon in and start stacking LD units like crazy. This is much simpler and more consistent than Bahamut stacking. Going back to yet another previous point that LD units cover, with LD you are also able to more accurately hit high knockback count enemies that just keeps on repositioning themselves like Rain D. So even if they reposition to safety, LD units can still hit them behind their cover. Going back to yet another previous point is about how long attack startup allows you to let enemies come into your range. Well, LD's Pierce also got that covered without any setup whatsoever. Going back even further to the previous point about being able to kill enemies faster and all that stuff, you know, with the bat jump scare, with the whole chart and everything, LD unit also has that advantage when it comes to killing enemies faster, as LD units are incredibly accurate. This is something that the number chart can't really show, but sometimes all these LD units might not even have like Bahamut's DPS. Sometimes they have like 3,000 or even lower, and yet they would able to contribute to a fight so much more than Bahamut, as their attacks are constantly not just accurate, but goes further beyond and hits super out of reach enemies. Oftentimes having these accuracies to your attack are more important than just having the damage output. High damage doesn't really mean much if you're gonna miss a lot of your attacks, or if your attack's gonna not reach certain enemies. That's why a lot of current top tier units, if you notice, are high damaging LD units, like Sirius, Lucifer, Gigapult, and Ghastly. LD units are just way too good. So good to the point that a big chunk of the things that I say kinda don't matter. A lot of powerful LD units, especially top tier Ubers, just have absurd strength that's just so overwhelming that not only it makes Bahamut looks useless, it also makes a lot of other Ubers look useless. I mean, we've already had this discussion before on my Ghastly video. I delve into this problem quite a bit more there, you can watch that video instead, but still, despite all that, I wanted to touch on this topic anyways. I still want to shed some light to the whole thing with low attack rate and all that stuff, because most of the things I say in this video doesn't only apply to Bahamut, but to a lot of other slow attack rate units. I actually like these kind of slow attacking NUKER units a lot. Yeah, they have their problems, and a lot of the times it can be a hindrance, but they really stand out from their peers. I know that the title and thumbnail of this video has been about Bahamut, but actually a lot of the things I say also applies to non-Bahamut stuff. Take like maybe comparing Can and Manic Island. These two units are pretty similar in range and DPS, but well, okay, Can has slightly more range, but aside from that, Can's nuke damage is better at killing certain peons that may have a lot of rebounds that Manic Island might have problem with, or when dealing with enemies with high range, Can just deal a singular nuke damage and be done with, while Manic Island have to do multiple hits for their damage to actually mean something, especially every time they get knocked back. That's also counted as wasting time. Similarly, like Can is Dancer, who also has a huge damage per hit, which helps him in one-shotting enemies, and especially better with the surge ability that he has. Another comparison is also like like Kador and Trash Cat, both being a ranged anti-zombie, with Kador being a rapid attacking unit and Trash Cat having extremely long time between attacks. But Trash Cat's bigger damage per hit allows it to instantly one-shot many major peon zombies like Zook, or even disrupt zombies burrow with its big damage. You can also say the same with Housewife, who also has pretty long time between attacks, but if her Savage Blow activates, she can instantly nuke down zombie enemies and either disrupt their burrows or maybe just outright kill them. There's also comparison to like Waitress compared to other crit units like Huracat or Aku Researcher, who attacks really fast. Waitress's big nuke damage allows her to instantly cripple or kill Super Metal Hippo in one shot, while other crit units has a tougher time killing them, maybe not necessarily harder, but it usually takes a longer time because Super Metal Hippo has a lot of knockback count, and any little crit dealt to Super Metal Hippo allows Super Metal Hippo to reposition himself. Moving on to like Ubers, there's also comparison between Twin Stars and Kalissa, where they're both like this rebound rusher units, except that Kalissa is able to be a more effective rusher due to her one-hit nuke damage, plus being able to use her rebound more effectively, as every time she gets rebound, she delivers a singular nuke damage again. Twin Stars is still a great unit, don't get me wrong, but she's better as a peon clearer than a rusher. When she gets rebounded, she still have to do a lot of hits to actually deliver a good amount of damage compared to Kalissa. Jizzo's Mega Castle also is another Uber with a long time between attacks, and with his also slow movement speed, he can also be stacked up before base hit. Another Uber is probably one of the most iconic nuker in the game, Last Voss. Last Voss has a really long time between attacks. She's extremely sluggish, but with an extremely crazy potential to one-shot or heavily cripple a huge chunk of super bosses in the game. He has become Neckonheimer, the destroyer of meta. Now you know what other Uber I can also talk about when it comes to this? That's right, it's Divine Kuu. Kuu, at least before her Ultra Talents, also has a really long attack rate with high damage per hit, about as much as Bahamut's actually. But her sluggish attack, low range, and lack of good immunities or abilities, as well as questionable target trait, makes her not really a popular pick amongst Ubers. People easily gets turned off from her super long attack rate, and her DPS isn't even really that big. Her attack start off animation isn't really terrible, but her lower than average range puts her in a dangerous situation a lot of the times, where enemies can easily disrupt her attack animation. Not to mention her role is kind of confusing, as she's this ranged unit with not enough range and is a tanker with not enough durability. I mean, I still really like her a lot for, you know, aside from her being really cute, but also I think that the properties of her being an odd semi-tanker as well as a long attack rate unit is a fun property to play with. You can stack her up before base hit, dealing with high damage knock count enemies more efficiently, and her decent HP and strong versus ability also allows her to be a pseudo tank, so she has enough bulk to tank attacks from certain high range enemies and land meaningful nuke hits, which is extremely helpful in enemies like Professor A or Hanya. And in specifically Hanya's stage, she's also not just useful for Hanya, she's also useful for killing the Aros, as she can potentially skip Aros' knockback count, which can be pretty annoying, as every time you knock Aros back, you're pushing towards Hanya's attack range, which leads to dangerous situation. But these are all before the Ultra Talents came in and gave her talents for a much faster attack rate. And since she keeps her nuke damage per hit, this amplifies her damage output by a huge amount. This easily changes her from a forgettable unit to a pretty powerful generalist, especially paired with her also new talent of relic targeting as well as surge immunity talent, which gives her a much wider variety for usages. So that's awesome, right? My favorite waifu finally gets the spotlight she deserves. But man, I actually kind of wish she didn't get that. I kind of wish she gets something else aside from faster attack rate talent. I mean, I want her damage output to be better, and that certainly comes true with better attack rate, but I wish it's true something else like Savage Blow, or Wave, or Surge ability. You know, maybe something like what they did with Juvens or Anubis, or maybe like something like a Strengthen ability, like what they did to her other fellow Galaxy Gals, Windy and Tundia. I know it's probably asking a little too much, like, come on bro, they already buff your waifu. You really don't get to complain when most other Uber gets the short end of the stick when it comes to Ultra Talents, as most Ultra Talents are pretty dog water. But I mean, I don't know, I still kind of miss that sluggish attack rate that she has. Her having a faster attack rate almost feels, I don't know, it makes her feel like a generic unit. I mean, she's a great unit, don't get me wrong, she's really powerful now, but man, it feels like part of her unique charm is gone, you know? It's kind of like when people people say that Cosmo's true form should have given him like shorter animation, which I like heavily disagree with, because I think that's what makes Cosmo truly special. And I kind of felt that with Kuu. It felt like she's no longer this sluggish unit, which was her whole main thing before. I mean, I think ultimately I'm still relatively happy with her Ultra Talents. I still really hate the implementation of Ultra Talents in general, but that's a topic for another day. But yeah, I mean, I still like her. Her attack rate isn't that crazy fast anyhow. I mean, having like too fast of an attack rate does have its own disadvantage. Having too slow of an attack rate also has disadvantage, and I guess being in the middle, you kind of have the disadvantage of both. But you know, there's always an advantage and disadvantage for having any kind of like these balancing stuff. Unless you count LD into the equation, which LD is just too good of an ability that most of the things I say don't really matter to LD Ubers. But hey, you don't always need to use top tier Ubers to win the game. Sometimes all you need is your old pal Bahamut cat. Next time you get stuck in a stage and need more damage output, wipe the dust off your second form Bahamut and maybe give it a spin. Maybe you can even try Bahamut stacking. Who knows how far they'll get you. The results may surprise you. He's got quite the power within him. Don't underestimate your old pal Bahamut cat. Anyway, I hope you learned a thing or two from this video. I still doubt that this matters much in the grander scheme of things, but who knows. Maybe this video is an awakening for some people to start using Bahamut more, and maybe people would like discover something super special with Bahamut cat. I don't know. But anyways, if you have any thoughts about this topic, be sure to leave a comment so I can see what you think. What do you think about Bahamut? Have you gotten some fond memories with him? Have you gotten some frustrating memories with him? Or are you like the type who pretty much have never touched him before because you immediately get like some good Uber and then you basically just never have touched the non-awakened Bahamut form? Anyways, I'll catch you another time. See ya.